Local history, local culture, local events, your community. This is the Joe Kelly Show.
Hi there, everybody. Welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us. Jerry Onart's our guest. Jerry has devoted 50 years to the study of John Butterfield of Utica, New York, and his Overland Mail Company, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. Not only is there a lot of history involved with this, but there's some new upcoming things, including a possible PBS special and a designation for the trail. But it all started right here in Utica, New York with John Butterfield. We'll get into all that, but first I want to welcome Jerry. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Good to have you here. Jerry, this really was a touch of genius, was it not, for John Butterfield to be able to do this?
Absolute genius. This was the longest stagecoach line in the world, 2,700 miles through the frontier. And they said it couldn't be done. Many of the newspapers, Washington, D.C., New York, said, oh, it's just impossible.
Yeah.
But he was the man for the job by a long shot. And he, absolute genius how he set up that trail, no doubt about it.
The trail started, you said, 2,700 miles, and it started in Tipton, Missouri, and went to San Francisco. And there were some branches of it, too. But what it did was unite the country.
Yes, that's what it was all about. Now, it actually was a single, well, not a single trail, it was bifurcated. Out of Memphis, Tennessee to Fort Smith, and then from St. Louis to Fort Smith. But the railroad took it for the first 160 miles to Tipton, Missouri. So Tipton, Missouri to San Francisco is 2,700 miles. Now, all of these contracts, this was the first government contract to unite the East to the West. They knew they had to do that. This was a prelude to the railroads. But to give it a start, they assigned this mail contract, a government contract to John Butterfield, knowing he would organize that southern overland trail, which was really a corridor that the immigrants went through. It was all aimed at immigrants settling the West.
And it, when it came out of Tipton, it dipped south, did it not? And then it went, what states are we talking about, Jerry?
That's correct. Now, the reason it did, it went through 8 states, dipped south, through Missouri, Arkansas, down in Indian Territory, it was called at the time, now Oklahoma, Texas, then into New Mexico, then Arizona, and it actually dipped for 56 miles into Mexico, get around the sand dunes, and back up into California. So it actually went through 8 states.
And when you say Mexico, do you say New Mexico or Mexico?
No, Mexico. It went through New Mexico, yes, but it also went through Mexico for 56 miles because when you get to Yuma, Arizona now, they had the famous Plank Road in the sand dunes right across the river. There were sand dunes there, and that trail could not go through those sand dunes. They had to go around it, so they dipped into Mexico.
I didn't realize that. And then it came up through to San Francisco. And the government contract called, did it not, Jerry, for this to be done each way, from San Francisco to Tipton and Tipton
Correct.
to San Francisco in 25 days or less, right?
That is correct.
Yeah. And he just made it on the first run, didn't he?
He made it in a little less than 25 days. Now, this was the inaugural one, and he knew he had to do it in 25 days or less. You know, coming from San Francisco at the same time that they left in Tipton, Missouri, the stages, a stagecoach left there at the same time on September 15th of 1858. And on board was Postal Inspector Goddard Bailey, assigned to, you know, when you have a government contract, it's a lot of money, just like now. And he inspected the trail to see if indeed Butterfield could meet the contract.
And the contract called for mail, but it also called for passengers, yes?
Well, the contract did not. See, this was the mail contract was the sole thing. Now, Butterfield carried passengers.
So he did that on his own? He
Yeah,
decided
a little added revenue. You know, by the way, I'll say this. The passengers were expendable. The mail was important. That was looked at first.
Gotcha. And what he did was he set up, way stations or relay stations
Yes.
along the way. How many of those were there?
This was his genius. They said it couldn't be done. There were 175 of them. Now, at both ends of the trail that were already settled to semi-settled. Fort Smith, Arkansas on the east end, and to Los Angeles on the western end. So they used trails that were already developed and had stagecoach lines on them before, and they used existing inns, hotels, etc. But between Fort Smith Arkansas, and Los Angeles, 1,920 miles, that was the frontier. Now, he had to develop many of his own stage stations there, every 15 miles on the average.
And those stations had food, had horses, drivers.
Now, this is an interesting part, very colorful part of that trail. Much of what they used were half-broken wild mules, which caused havoc with those stages. And what they call Mustangs, the wild horses, which were half-broken. And it caused many a colorful situation. Now, each station, on the whole, only had 4 employees. Now, unfortunately, in 1958, a fellow named Holland wrote columns, because it was the 100th anniversary. But see, they didn't have the information now. I'm not criticizing him because he told stories out of school or something. It's they didn't have the information we have now. And those stations, yes, did have some, as many as 10 employees, where the Apaches were on the north-south trail, the raiding trails into Mexico. Those were stone-fortified stations, not adobe. So it was a mixture of what he had. The average station was 4 employees. And I'll say this was before the cowboy. There's 3 eras, what I call the old West before the Civil War, that dead spot the Civil War, then the West as we know it, we see on TV, et cetera, in the 1870s after the Civil War.
Excuse me, Jerry,
Go ahead.
those stations were named, each had a name, and some of those names came from our area, yes?
That's a hugely important part. Even the PBS show, I had a conference call with the filmmaker out of Hollywood last week, and his assistant, I should say, that's going to be on PBS. And this was a very, very important part of it. Arizona was only 1/8 of the trail is in Arizona. Yet, in Arizona, there were 26 Butterfield stations he developed. There were 2 stone-fortified ones, 1 made out of logs, and the rest were crude adobe stations. Very crude. And now here's a very interesting part. The other key figure, besides John Butterfield and all this, was a fellow named Marcus L. Kenyon, buried in Rome, New York.
Hang on to that thought for a second, because we want to talk about Mr. Kenyon, and we're going to do that right after this break. Jerry Arnott's our guest. We're talking about John Butterfield of Utica, New York. Short break, right back.